Hello Penguinauts, I'm the Baby Penguin and welcome back to Kerbal Rising. In the last episode we began our invasion of Gaia with the ISS Trojan and the ISS Spirit of Dreidos, our two Neptune class carriers. However, although we made some progress destroying a naval vessel, we hit a bit of a speed bump at 50,000 miles an hour, considering the fact that we tried to gain air superiority over the two continents where the Gaian populace is most concentrated and failed utterly miserably when we encountered the Firestorm, a exceptional fighter developed by the Gaian Confederacy which uses antimatter powered engines. So we went back to the drawing board with the fighter. Well, not back to the drawing board entirely, but as you can see before you, we've made an entirely new aircraft, the Alara Mark II, now using antimatter engines, and it has a much more sophisticated aerodynamic profile. I spent quite a few hours, I'm not even ashamed to admit, just tweaking the aerodynamics of this aircraft to make it absolutely perfect. And you can see just from the angle of attack we're entering the atmosphere at here, these things are really stable. It's easy enough to make a maneuverable aircraft with these antimatter powered engines. The more difficult thing is making an aircraft that while you're travelling at Mach 3 at sea level can make a turn as sharp as the one we're currently making and not enter a flat spin immediately. And that took quite a lot of time to make an aircraft that's just stable enough, and it's really a perfect balancing act between the centre of mass, the centre of lift, and its position with relative to the rest of the aircraft and the mass of the whole aircraft entirely. This was made much easier by the fact we're using thermal ramjets, so we don't have to carry really much fuel on the aircraft whatsoever. But after quite a lot of time balancing, I think we've developed a very capable fighter aircraft. So the two Alaras are now soaring in towards the Gaian airbase for round 2. So here we go. The two Gaian fighters, the Firestorms, are taking off, and we're throwing some pretty crazy evasive maneuvers as they loose their missiles towards us. Now, these dogfights are going to take place at pretty insane speeds because, of course, all four fighters here are antimatter powered and can accelerate easily up to Mach 2 while near sea level. So we're loosing our missiles, but I mean, we don't really expect them to do a great deal considering that these planes can literally out-accelerate the missiles that they fire. Yeah, the missiles don't really have room for antimatter reactors on them. However, the first Firestorm immediately gets on the tail of our wingman, and even though we fly in to aid him, he's struggling to get off him. The dogfight here seems to be kind of decided by who can get on whose tail first, and then once they're on the tail you can't really do much about it. The Firestorm swoops in, shoots our wingman, but then the antimatter reactor is breached and it takes the Firestorm with it. Dangers of using antimatter reactors here. The explosion caused by the antimatter reactor being breached and the antimatter annihilating took the Firestorm with it because it closed the distance far too much. The second Firestorm isn't giving us a moment to rest though. However, the Alara Mark II is actually a faster aircraft than the Firestorm, so we can quite easily out-accelerate it and put some distance between us and get outside of its gun range. Once we've sufficiently tailed it and we've got it out to a good distance so we can turn ourselves around, we line up a missile and we get it heading straight towards us. We fire off two AIM-9 heat seekers which cause it to break low. We open up with the 20mm and we strip it to pieces. There we go. Bam! Who said that I couldn't develop some pretty capable fighters myself? I had so many comments like, oh, well, looks like Beardy's going to have to send in the anti-aircraft tanks or something lame like that. No, I rose to the challenge, and the Alara Mark II was more than capable of dealing with them. So, back out in space, the Spirit of Dreidos was at Scorch last turn, delivering the Crimson Fleet to destroy the Krios pirates in orbit, but it's going to head back to Gaia now in order to help us conquer the rest of the planet. However, with the current orientation of the planets and the orbits, we can actually swing by Dreidos first and give ourselves a new loadout of 2 Ison class tanks aboard a single Mercury class dropship, because I don't think the tactical bomber that we had, the Callisto, is going to be a great help here because we have quite a few ground targets to take out. And although the Callisto is a very capable aircraft, it only carries 6 Maverick missiles, and that's not quite enough to deal with the amount of targets we have here. So here we go, we're entering the atmosphere with the Mercury class. Now, the Mercury dropship, it's it's not quite as stable as the Alara. I think I got too used to entering the atmosphere using the Alara Mark II. So I go in at quite a high angle of attack, and this thing, it's a lot heavier and it's a lot less aerodynamically stable. So after we start entering, yeah, we pretty quickly lose control of the Mercury entirely. Certainly putting those tank crewmen under quite significant G-forces. But they're strapped into crash couches, so hopefully we won't find them as a smear of red mist plastered all over the walls. But we managed to regain control of the Mercury, and we get ourselves heading just over a mountain. Thankfully we didn't quite crash into it, and heading towards the Gaian base to deploy our tanks and restore order to this anarchic planet. So we're keeping low, we're keeping behind the mountains here to make sure that they can't see our radar cross-section, and we're putting down on this little flat bit of land just about 25 kilometers away from the Gaian base. Bring ourselves to a gentle stop, and then we open up the rear cargo bay and we unload our tanks. Using these 75mm chain guns, so we won't actually be using these after this turn, because it was after I performed my turn, I actually did a massive overhaul of our entire mod pack. So these weapons aren't actually scaled properly. You can probably tell that these, even though they're 75mm, they're not the right size for 75mm. So these guns are actually much bigger now. So the Isons are now using 105s. Well, they will do in the next episode. But anyway, as we approach the Gaian base, we get a good look at the surrounding structures, and it has a certain familiar theme to it. So now we've identified the structures and the locations of the vehicles within, we're going to close with our Isons and we're going to restore order to them. They'll be thanking us later when their children aren't starving. Right, here we go. So heading down towards them, they have two tanks with 120mm main cannons and then a single anti-aircraft tank. Now, although those 120mm cannons are very powerful, for some reason they're not actually that accurate, and the rate of fire is really, really low, especially compared to these 75mm chain guns. Now, although these things aren't actually all that accurate, they have a crazy rate of fire considering their caliber. Hence why we've now balanced it by making them a lot larger. But we get this pretty cool shot of us screaming down the hill, and we don't actually have to directly hit these tanks because, of course, we fire explosive rounds. So we just have to hit relatively near to the tanks and we're going to be able to damage them. And with this rate of fire, there's very, very little that they can do to just stop us completely obliterating them and laying waste to the surrounding structures. Well, I mean, they've already been pretty destroyed. I mean, the whole planet's gone to hell, hasn't it? But hey, you know. And pretty quickly, you can see we've knocked off the turret of one of the first tanks, and now they're pretty much completely defenseless. We swapped to the AA tank, which is trying to get shots at us, but just sort of shooting the remains of, I think that's the R&D center? Or is that the astronaut complex? No, that is the R&D center. So what we do is we move the tank outwards so it can get a shot on us and actually make things fair. And although it does get some good hits on us, our medium tanks have got 150mm of armor, and against 20mm rounds, yeah, they're not going to do much against their armor, so they're mostly just bouncing off relatively harmlessly. We get some returning fire, and we promptly obliterate it. And that is Gaia, fully liberated and under control of the Dreidos Imperium. It was a little embarrassing, our stall last turn, but there we go. As you see, the tank has had its turret firmly removed, and there's very, very little left of the rest of them. And now we can begin finally rebuilding our home world, reclaiming the birthplace of Kerbal kind for the Imperium. So, in order to do that, we're going to need to send some colony ships to the Gaia system. We spent all of our points this turn on a colonial flotilla. One of them is heading to Gull, or the moon, and it's going to build a mining installation there, and the rest of them are going to head straight to Gaia, begin relief efforts, begin giving food out to the relatively starved and anarchic populace, begin restoring it to its former glory. But in the meantime, we're going to be sending our two carriers, the ISS Trojan and the ISS Spirit of Dreidos, out to Scorch. If you're wondering, we're actually incorporating 2 turns into one in this turn once again. We did this once before, but when we have a certain amount of things we want to get done in a turn, or when like 2 turns are just not going to have enough content separately, we do combine them into one video. So this is actually our second turn now, if you're wondering why we were able to do so many interplanetary jumps this turn. So although we destroyed the Krios pirates in orbit around Scorch last episode, we didn't take out their ground forces. Now Captain Krios, he's long since fled using a pretty rudimentary fusion torch propelled spacecraft. He's going to have to go somewhere using an old transfer orbit. He can't go directly anywhere, he doesn't have Kerbstein drives. So we won't be seeing him for quite some time. But his cronies on the surface are still holding out, refusing to hand themselves over to the Dreidos Imperium. So we're going to have to descend to the surface and deal with them. And of course, first we're sending our Callisto class tactical bomber. Now we've got quite a few targets on the ground here. They have quite a significant presence at this little mining installation that they have here, funding their criminal activities throughout the system. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and take out as many as possible using the Callisto, but we don't actually have enough missiles to take them all out. So we're going to have to send in some forces afterwards, hence why we brought both carriers here. Now we're actually having some trouble painting our targeting laser on the ground targets because the surface temperature of Scorch is so hot it's difficult to actually get an infrared signature on them. So we have to actually close to some pretty close ranges where we're almost within their range of their anti-aircraft guns before we can begin firing our missiles. But we lose 2 Mavericks all the same, and they head straight in towards the first enemy battle tank. And it's lining up pretty well. The anti-aircraft fire opens up, but it can't stop both missiles slamming into the tank and promptly obliterating it. For some reason, Vessel Switch is playing up as well. You see in the top left, even though I believe there are 6 ground targets in total, it's only showing 2 of them. I'm not entirely sure what that was about, but we have some anti-aircraft fire heading up towards us, so we're going to get the hell out of dodge using the antimatter powered engines on the Callisto. Since we scaled down the reactors quite a bit, the resulting antimatter explosion from these being breached isn't that extreme. If you breach a 3.75 meter one, then the resulting explosion is a couple of kilotons, but with the tiny ones that we're using, it would only really vaporize everything within maybe about 500 meters. So yeah, it's not going to be a particularly viable tactic to try and fly low and take some of them with us. It was apparently a viable tactic in the dogfight earlier, but yeah, it's going to be certainly the best idea to just not get shot in the first place here. So the second target we're going for is one of the anti-aircraft trucks here, because we want to take these out first just to try and make our own job a little bit easier, because while we're painting the target with our targeting laser, we're a sitting duck. Because these aren't fire and forget missiles, you have to guide them all the way down to the target. But we get a pretty good strike on it nonetheless. There's one sitting on top of the biodome, but I would rather not damage the infrastructure too much. I don't know what it is with putting tanks on biodomes in this series. A lot of people must have been yeah, decompressed in this series. It's kind of something I don't really want to think about. But anyway, we're going to go for one of the armoured vehicles on one of the landing pads instead. So we loose a missile towards it, but we actually kind of overshoot with our aircraft, so we're having a little bit of trouble painting the targeting laser on it. And as such, we sort of rush to try and get it lined back up again, but I don't think we line it up perfectly. And the missile does fly in, but it doesn't actually quite hit it dead on, and it is an armoured target as well, so we're going to have to fire at it again. And we are very fast running out of missiles with this Callisto, so we're going to have to try and make it count, take out this last vehicle, and then we'll have to close with our ground forces. So we flip ourselves around, line it up, and we're going to try and make this last missile count. So we're going to try and take this out, and then what will be left is a single anti-aircraft tank and then one of those main battle tanks with the 120mm gun. Not the same model as the ones on Gaia, but it uses the same main cannon, so they're relatively similar in style. So we line up our targeting laser once more. It's much easier to target them when there's actually a piece of Kerbal Konstructs stuff there, so it's much easier to lock onto one of the structures than it is to actually lock onto the vehicles themselves. I didn't realise that the actual surface temperature of a planet would affect the targeting system, but it actually does, since it uses infrared, and Scorch is so unbelievably close to Kerbol. It's certainly going to be useful for pretty much launching to any of the inner planets, because if you think about it, the inner planets inside the solar system, they orbit much faster. So if you want to get from one side to the other, all you have to do is wait a month, and then the orbits will have changed and you can jump to the other side of the solar system. which certainly makes things quite convenient. Unfortunately, our first missile doesn't quite work, so we lose our final one towards the enemy tank. I thought we only had one missile left, but no, we do fire 2 missiles towards this thing, and we need to make this one count because it's still not dead, and we've already wasted 2 missiles on this thing. So we line up the laser absolutely perfectly, guiding it gently in all the way towards the enemy vessel, and sure enough, this one looks pretty damn good, flies in towards the enemy tank and promptly obliterates it. So all we have now to destroy is a single tank with 120mm, which, well, we showed our Ison class tanks are more than capable of taking those out, and a single anti-aircraft tank, which shouldn't be able to get through our armour anyway. So we should be pretty good with restoring order to this crazy hot planet. But we're just going to return the Callisto back up to the ISS Trojan and head down with our Mercury class dropship. The re-entry is a little less eventful this time. The atmosphere on Scorch is almost as thick as Kerbin's, or Gaia's I should say. It's almost 1 atmosphere. I think it's 0.9. But the gravity is only about 0.5 Gs, so our orbital velocity is significantly lower. So we're only entering the atmosphere at about Mach 3. So all we have to do is basically have a very slight angle of attack, and we're slowing ourselves down pretty damn quickly. So we don't even get any flames, which is kind of sad. I mean, to be fair, the whole planet is on fire, so I mean, technically we're getting more flames because the planet itself is melting. I'm kind of curious as to how it's managed to retain an atmosphere this thick, considering how close it is to Kerbal. You would have thought that the atmosphere would have been stripped away by now, but perhaps its planet only formed relatively recently, or perhaps the actual atmosphere is created by the outer layers of the planet actually evaporating off. I don't know. Is that a thing? Maybe it's a thing. I'll have to look into it. But either way, we have a pretty uneventful ride in. We have to use the mountains for cover, so we're flying very low to the ground to make sure that the anti-aircraft tank can't shoot down our dropship, because it's very hilly terrain, so it would be quite a trek if we set down 20 kilometers away, well out of gun range, and just got our tanks to drive there. And also, we have to be careful about where we land on this planet. If you land down too close to, I don't want to say sea level, but lava level, I guess, then your actual craft start melting, which is not good. So you want to be landing on the hills and maintaining some altitude, because you get too close to the surface of the planet, well, say, you know, the hotter parts of the planet, and your craft start overheating and exploding. So yeah, that wouldn't be ideal, hence why we're landing up on this hill to make sure that our wheels don't melt and strand our crews here on the surface of Scorch. Those of you who are wondering, by the way, I did mention that Krios Pirates, that was actually a reference to something, and unlike with Preston Kerman, where you all identified that was Admiral Preston Cole from Halo, Krios, none of you got that. I had a lot of people suggesting Thane Krios from Mass Effect, and that's a decent guess, I guess. But the Krios Pirates, that's actually a much more niche reference to a game called Infinite Space, which was just the best game ever on the DS, and basically was my entire childhood. Yeah, that's just such a niche reference. No one's ever played that game, but there you go, the Krios Pirates. If you were wondering, that's what that was a reference to. But we don't have much more time to talk about references, because the enemy are opening fire, and they're not letting up. They're putting in a hail of fire on us and getting some pretty good hits. But thankfully, the rate of fire of these 75mm chain guns comes out on top. And as such, we managed to obliterate the enemy tank relatively easily. However, we do have a bit of a problem. You see, the biodome is actually protecting the enemy anti-aircraft tank from our shots, but it's not stopping it arcing its shots up over the top of the biodome and hitting us. So it can shoot us, but we can't shoot it. So the key here is going to be going as fast as possible to close this distance and get out of the firing line. These might only be 20mm rounds and bouncing off our armor, but if they hit us with enough of them, they can do some serious damage. The Isons used to have 200mm of armor, but then we changed our armor rules, so 150mm of armor, you get hit with enough explosive 20mm rounds, that's going to start making some dents. So we need to make sure we close the distance pretty fast. We do end up using this little hill here for a bit of cover, and it gives us a pretty brief respite before we make the final dash, go over the top and rush the enemy position. Thankfully now though, we're close enough that it can't arc its shots over the top anymore. We're getting some pretty sick airs actually in the 0.5 Gs of gravity. It's just kind of the perfect level of gravity for these tanks. They can accelerate to some pretty insane speeds, but also they're not floating up off the surface, so you don't have to actually use the RCS thrusters to keep them under control. Soon enough though, we manage to close round to the side of the biodome and we loose a hail of explosive 75mm shells into the side of the anti-aircraft tank. Probably, almost certainly, breaching the sides of the biodome. Hopefully all of the citizens inside will, well, to be fair, they're all pirates, so they're not exactly good people, but still, hopefully they managed to get to vacuum suits in time and they managed to save themselves so that we can put them to work in the mines. And of course, to do that, we're going to have to send some colony ships. However, we're not actually building 2 mining installations, although we build, well, we resupply this mining installation and get it up and running again after all the battle damage that we did. We're actually building a military garrison here as well with our 2nd colony ship. The reason this is necessary is because we've been detecting some weapons fire, garbled radio messages, and more worryingly, Kerbstein drive signatures coming from Moho. Now, we don't have anything out that far, so whatever's making those Kerbstein drive signatures has a technology level similar to our own, but it isn't us. So this could constitute a pretty serious threat to the Imperium. And as such, since Scorch is pretty much on the front lines, we need to make sure it's well defended to guard the passage to Gaia and onwards to the homeworld of Dreidos. So, in order to try and make sense of these garbled radio transmissions, we've constructed a listening station as well, guarded by 3 of our Alara Mark II fighters, and we receive a pretty worrying broadcast.
Do you want freedom? No? Too bad. The United Federation of Nebos, bringing liberty to a space oil field near you.
Now this is very concerning, not only because this Federation of Nebos has a similar technology level to our own, but also because of the false values they preach. Democracy, freedom, the very values which led to the weakness which caused our world to succumb to nuclear hellfire in the first place. We can't allow these lies to follow us out and shape our destiny in the future. We need to eradicate this United Federation of Nebos before it can spread its cancerous ways across the system. Before we can do that though, we're certainly going to need to scout them out, gauge their defences and their capabilities, and for that purpose we have launched the ISS ANUBIS, a Europa-class stealth frigate, utilising the very latest in our stealth technology. I'll explain more about how stealth ships work in the next episode when we send it to the other side of the system to begin investigating this Federation. For now though, I'll just give you a hint of its capabilities before bringing the episode to a close. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. I do hope you've enjoyed. Things are really going to start heating up in the Kerbal system next episode. Hope you're looking forward to it as much as I am. I've been the Beardy Penguin, and I will see you all next time.